Resident Evil is one of the most iconic survival horror franchises, known for its terrifying enemies and some truly difficult boss fights. Whether it's a monstrous bioweapon or a crazed villain transformed into a grotesque creature, Resident Evil bosses have tested the limits of players. So today, let's dive into the 10 hardest boss fights in Resident Evil games. Starting off our list is Derek Simmons from Resident Evil 6. Simmons is one of those bosses that just refuses to go down. By the time you face him in Leon's campaign, he's already mutated into this grotesque abomination thanks to the C virus. And the worst part, he doesn't stop at one form. Simmons mutates into several different increasingly monstrous creatures, a giant beast, a dinosaur-like horror, and even a grotesque spider hybrid. This fight is hard not just because of his unpredictable attacks, but because of how long it drags on. It feels like every time you think you've beaten him, he just gets up and mutates into something even worse. For me, this boss fight is more about endurance than anything else. The different forms he takes keep you on edge, but man, after what feels like 15 minutes of non-stop shooting, it can get pretty exhausting. You start to wonder, when will this guy just die already? It's definitely one of those fights that tests both your skill and your patience. Next up, we have Alex Wesker from Resident Evil Revelations 2. Now, Alex Wesker isn't just your typical boss, she's creepy cunning, and her final form is pure nightmare fuel. After infecting herself with the T-Phobos virus, she transforms into this grotesque, hulking monster with a massive exposed weak spot that's deceptively hard to hit. Alex's quick movements and brutal attacks force you to constantly stay on the move, but here's the kicker: you're not just fighting Alex. The arena is full of environmental hazards, making it even harder to land clean shots while avoiding being obliterated. I remember this fight vividly because it genuinely stressed me out. Alex's mutating form is terrifying to look at, and her ability to cloak herself at times makes her even harder to pin down. For me, this boss fight felt like a never-ending game of cat and mouse. And if you're low on ammo, good luck. This fight will push you to your absolute limits. In Chris Redfield's campaign of Resident Evil 6, you face one of the series' most imposing bioweapons, House. This towering snake-like creature is an absolute menace. The fight takes place in an underwater facility that feels like it's collapsing around you, creating this constant sense of urgency. House is fast for its size, which makes the fight especially nerve-wracking, and it feels like you're always one wrong step away from getting crushed. What makes this boss fight even more stressful is the environment. It's a maze of narrow corridors and tight spaces, leaving you little room to maneuver as House barrels down on you. This boss fight stands out to me for how claustrophobic it feels. You're in this tight space, the stakes are high, and House is just so fast for such a massive creature. I remember running through the corridors, barely staying ahead of it, thinking, how am I supposed to kill this thing? It's one of those fights where you just don't feel safe at any point.
Not for long.
In Resident Evil Revelations, the final form of Jack Norman, known as the Ultimate Abyss, is a brutal encounter that many players dread. The arena for the fight is wide open, but that's hardly comforting when your opponent can turn nearly invisible and hit like a truck. The Ultimate Abyss has multiple devastating attacks, including a powerful ground slam and ranged energy blasts. To make matters worse, you have to carefully time your shots while dodging his attacks, and his erratic movements make him difficult to predict. It's a battle that requires both patience and precision, and trust me, that's easier said than done. Honestly, this boss fight really plays with your nerves. The fact that the Ultimate Abyss can disappear makes it feel like a horror game within a horror game. You're constantly on edge trying to spot him before he strikes, and every time you miss a shot, you feel that tension building. It's an unforgiving fight and one that I wasn't eager to replay. Resident Evil 2 Remake brought back Mr. X in a big way, and his final form as the Super Tyrant is nothing short of terrifying. The fight takes place on a rooftop with limited space to dodge his relentless attacks. He's faster, stronger, and more aggressive than any form you've encountered before. His claw swipes can take you out in just a few hits, and if you mistime your dodges, you're in for a world of hurt. What makes this fight so challenging is that you need to balance dodging with landing precise shots on his weak points, all while staying calm. I still get stressed thinking about this fight. The Super Tyrant is just an unstoppable force, and every second feels like a life or death situation. It's one of those bosses where if you panic, it's over. I remember barely surviving my first playthrough and thinking, thank God that's over. It's easily one of the hardest boss fights in the remake.
We'll call it even.
Where did this thing go?
In the Resident Evil 4 remake, Osmond Saddler has undergone a terrifying transformation, becoming a multi-legged monstrosity. The fight against him is long and grueling with multiple phases where he'll switch between long-range and close-range attacks. His weak points are hidden beneath tough armor, which forces you to wait for the perfect moment to land a hit. Meanwhile, he's sending smaller enemies your way to distract you. It's a fight that requires constant attention to detail and quick reflexes. For me, the Saddler fight is exhausting in the best way possible. It's one of those boss battles where you feel like you're always on the back foot. Every time I thought I had him figured out, he'd switch up his tactics, forcing me to adapt. It's a real test of your situational awareness, and I found myself running low on ammo more than once. Definitely a highlight of the remake.
Finally, a look that suits you, Saddler. A monster in and out. Still, I need to cut this date short. It's not me. It's you.
Nemesis is one of the most iconic Resident Evil villains, and in Resident Evil 3 Remake, he's deadlier than ever. Throughout the game, he mutates into several horrifying forms, each more dangerous than the last. Nemesis is fast, aggressive, and constantly on your heels. His relentless pursuit through the city streets and confined spaces keeps you in a constant state of panic, and when he mutates into his final form, the battle becomes a chaotic struggle for survival. I have a love-hate relationship with Nemesis in this remake. On one hand, it's an incredible fight that keeps you on edge. On the other hand, the constant pressure makes it one of the most stressful experiences in the game. There's something about knowing he's always right behind you that makes each encounter feel like you're barely scraping by. Definitely one of the hardest bosses in the series, no question.
Power sources activated. Powering
You think
up.
I don't know how to fuck you up?
William Birkin, particularly in Claire's campaign in Resident Evil 2 Remake, is a multi-phase boss fight that feels like it never ends. Birkin's G-virus mutations make him increasingly more monstrous and dangerous. By the time you face him in his final form, he's a towering beast with wild, erratic movements that make him hard to predict. Each phase gets harder, and ammo becomes more precious as you struggle to land critical shots while avoiding his devastating attacks. Birkin is one of those bosses that sticks with you long after the fight is over. It's exhausting in the best way possible. Just when you think you've got him beat, he comes back more monstrous than ever. I remember thinking, how many times am I going to have to fight this guy? But that's part of what makes the encounter so satisfying once you finally take him down. The Queen Leech in Resident Evil 0 is a nightmare to deal with. Not only is she massive and powerful, but her attacks are unpredictable and hit hard. You have to fight her in 2 phases, and in the second phase she transforms into an even more terrifying form. The arena is claustrophobic, which adds to the tension, and her attacks are brutal, making this one of the hardest boss fights in the series. This fight is a real test of endurance and resource management. I remember running out of ammo mid-fight and panicking because I wasn't sure if I could take her down with just my remaining supplies. The Queen Leech's second form is especially intimidating, and it's a boss that leaves you feeling drained by the end. Last but certainly not least, we have Jack Baker from Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Jack is relentless throughout the game, and by the time you face his final form, he's mutated into a grotesque mass of flesh and tentacles. His attacks are brutal, and you have to keep moving while landing shots on his weak points. This fight is intense, and Jack's constant taunting makes it all the more unnerving. There's also a psychological element here. After everything he's put you through, this fight feels personal. This is one of the most unsettling boss fights in the series for me. Jack's transformation is disgusting to look at, and the way he taunts you throughout the battle adds this psychological pressure that makes it feel even harder. It's a fight that sticks with you long after the credits roll, and it's easily one of my favorite boss encounters in the Resident Evil series.
This is getting old, Jack.
These are just a few of the hardest boss fights that have haunted Resident Evil players for years. Which boss fight gave you the most trouble? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and also hit that bell for more survival horror content. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.